In mid-19th century Vienna, a young physician named Ignaz Semmelweis encountered a catastrophe. Thousands of women having just given birth were dying in agony from a mysterious childbed fever. Their bodies were consumed by an internal fire. Medicine was powerless, and doctors merely threw up their hands, attributing the deaths to unknown forces. But Semmelweis refused to accept such fatalism. He saw an invisible killer, microscopic particles that doctors, unknowingly, carried from cadavers in the dissecting room to the birthing mothers in the wards. He proposed a solution that was shockingly simple for its time: mandatory hand washing with chlorinated lime. And a miracle occurred. Mortality rates plummeted from 10% to less than 1%, saving the lives of hundreds of thousands of mothers. Semmelweis became a savior, a harbinger of a new era in medicine, and the father of antisepsis. Yet, instead of triumph, his discovery met with fierce resistance. His ideas undermined the authority of physicians, who could not admit that their own hands were responsible for spreading death. Semmelweis was branded a madman. He was despised, persecuted, and eventually ended his days in a mental asylum, broken by a system unwilling to confront the truth. Only decades later was his genius finally recognized. This is how true scientific breakthroughs emerge. Not in the quiet of offices, nor amidst the applause of colleagues. They break through resistance, ignorance, and cruelty. This is not a story of a genius met with accolades, but of a man whose foresight was rejected by his own era. It's a testament to why the path to truth is often paved not with recognition, but with suffering. In the mid-19th century, long before the true causes of diseases were understood, medicine was shrouded in deep darkness. Physicians, respected members of society, relied not on observation and experiment, but on ancient teachings and dogmas passed down through centuries. They believed illnesses arose from an imbalance of bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow, and black bile. Alternatively, miasma, harmful vapors or putrid air, was blamed. The notion of invisible, living disease agents seemed absurd and fantastical. No one washed their hands before examining patients. Instruments were passed from one sick person to another, often without even being wiped clean. Dirt, blood, and pus were considered common accompaniments to healing. Furthermore, an abundance of pus in a wound was seen as a good sign, a symbol of purification. It was even called laudable pus. Hospitals of that era were not places of healing, but rather death sentences. Open wards, filled with groans, the stench of decay, and fear, served as ideal breeding grounds for infection. Surgical interventions, performed without anesthesia or any understanding of asepsis, became torturous ordeals. To stop bleeding, wounds were cauterized with red-hot irons or doused with boiling oil. Any injury, even the most minor, could lead to fatal infection. Abdominal or chest surgeries were virtually equivalent to a death sentence. Death was ubiquitous, accepted as an inevitable companion of existence. People lived in constant anticipation of an invisible blow that could strike at any moment, from any fever, any wound. This world, where suffering was the norm and ignorance the sole truth, desperately needed enlightenment. Into this world consumed by darkness stepped the young Ignaz Semmelweis. Born in Buda, in what is now Hungary, he received his education in Vienna, the heart of the medical world at that time. Though he initially studied law, he soon abandoned jurisprudence, feeling a different calling. His path led him to medicine. He graduated from the University of Vienna with a doctorate, and in 1847 he secured a position as an assistant at the first obstetrical clinic of the Vienna General Hospital. It was here that Ignaz confronted a horrifying reality that profoundly shook him. A daily tragedy unfolded before his eyes. The clinic was divided into two divisions. In the first, where doctors and medical students worked, the mortality rate for birthing mothers from childbed fever reached monstrous proportions. 1 in 10 women died. In the second, where midwives attended births, the rates were significantly lower. This striking contrast tormented Semmelweis. Why? He observed how doctors, fresh from performing autopsies in the anatomical theater, immediately proceeded to examine living patients. They did not wash their hands. They did not change their gowns. Death was their constant companion, imperceptibly transferring from the dead to the living. Semmelweis observed. He correlated facts. He sought answers where others saw only ill fate. A turning point arrived in March 1847. Semmelweis's close friend, Professor Jakob Kolechka, a forensic pathologist, died from a small wound inflicted by a student's scalpel during a cadaver dissection. Semmelweis was present at Kolechka's autopsy. What he saw shocked him. The condition of the professor's internal organs, the nature of the inflammation, everything, down to the smallest detail, mirrored the pathology he had observed in women who died from childbed fever. This was a revelation, an epiphany. An invisible agent, transferred from dead flesh, had killed his friend. It was killing mothers in precisely the same way. For Semmelweis, this was undeniable proof. He realized that what he termed cadaveric particles were the cause of death. These particles, invisible to the eye, landed on doctors' hands in the dissecting room and were then transferred to the bodies of birthing women. The solution, so obvious to him, was revolutionary. He immediately issued an order. All doctors and students, before touching birthing mothers, must meticulously wash their hands, not just with water, but with a solution of chlorinated lime, an acrid but powerful disinfectant. The resistance was fierce. Doctors were outraged, considering it humiliating to wash their hands before every examination. But Semmelweis was unyielding. He demanded compliance. The results were immediate. As if by magic, mortality in his division plummeted. In April 1847, it stood at 18.3%. In May, after the introduction of mandatory handwashing, it dropped to 2.2%. By June, it was down to 1.2%. In some months, the mortality rate was 0. Hundreds of lives were saved. This was more than just a success. It was a triumph of reason over centuries of ignorance, a visible demonstration that truth, no matter how inconvenient, could shatter the most entrenched dogmas. Semmelweis did not possess a microscope capable of revealing invisible bacteria. The germ theory of disease was still decades away. His genius lay elsewhere, in tireless, almost obsessive observation and unwavering logic. He did not trust abstract theories about miasmas, harmful vapors, or imbalances of bodily fluids. He trusted only what he saw with his own eyes, what was confirmed by numbers. He systematically collected statistics, meticulously comparing mortality rates between divisions, seeking undeniable patterns. He saw that in one wing of the clinic, women were dying in horrifying numbers, while in the other, the rates were significantly lower. He observed doctors and students, barely finished with cadaver dissections, immediately moving on to living patients. This was pure, relentless empiricism, a method based on experience and data, not on speculative conclusions or ancient dogmas. He was a pioneer who not only asked questions, but also listened to the answers provided by real, tangible facts. His revolutionary toolkit was simple yet powerful. Firstly, it was his own sharp mind, capable of discerning cause and effect relationships where others saw only ill fate. Secondly, it was his persistent, uncompromising demand for protocol adherence. washing hands with a concentrated chlorinated lime solution became not merely a hygienic procedure, but a strict mandatory ritual to be performed by anyone who touched birthing mothers. He did not limit himself to a general prescription. He implemented a new, rigidly regulated practice that became his primary weapon against the invisible killer. He also learned from his mistakes, constantly refining his method. Even after mortality in his division plummeted to near zero, it once again crept upward. Why? Semmelweis delved back into his observations, not resting on his initial stunning successes. He discovered that students, after examining patients with purulent discharges or cervical cancer, proceeded to examine healthy birthing mothers. This was a new, previously unaccounted for source of cadaveric particles, now not from the dead, but from living infected organisms. He immediately expanded his rules. Hand disinfection became mandatory after examining any infected patient, not just after working in the anatomical theater. He also began to demand thorough disinfection of all medical instruments after each use. His method was continuously perfected, adapting to new challenges, becoming more comprehensive. He never stopped at what he had achieved, always seeking new ways to protect life, striving for absolute zero mortality. He even attempted to disseminate his ideas, publishing articles and reports, including in German, trying to convey his truth to a wider audience than just his Austrian colleagues. However, this triumph of common sense was met not with recognition, but with a solid wall of fierce rejection. Vienna's medical establishment, rigid in its centuries-old beliefs, could not accept his discoveries. This undermined not just their methods, but the very foundation of their authority. How could these esteemed professors, these luminaries of science, admit that they themselves, with their own hands, were bringing death to their patients? It was unthinkable. Their world, built on ancient dogmas, the infallibility of hierarchy, and blind faith in speculative theories, was shaken to its core. Their arguments against Semmelweis were varied and often verged on the absurd. Some indignantly claimed that washing hands with acrid chlorinated lime irritated doctors' skin, making their hands rough and unsuitable for delicate examination manipulations. Others, stubbornly clinging to prevailing theory, insisted that the true cause of childbed fever was miasma, harmful air, or cosmic telluric influences emanating from the stars. They simply could not conceive of invisible particles being carried on hands. The idea of living, yet unseen, disease agents was too alien to their understanding, too fantastical. They accused Semmelweis of lacking a scientific explanation, as he could not show them these particles under a microscope. He was merely a young assistant, a foreigner from Hungary, who dared to challenge established authorities and a whole cohort of eminent professors. His ideas contradicted everything they had been taught. Accusations poured in from all sides. He was called an eccentric, a fanatic, obsessed with his idea, and someone who debased the dignity of physicians. His ideas were ridiculed in lectures, and his methods were demonstrably ignored. Professor Karl von Braun, his immediate superior, fiercely opposed him, seeing Semmelweis as a direct threat to his own position, the clinic's traditions, and his reputation. He refused to acknowledge the obvious results. Ultimately, Semmelweis was dismissed from his assistant position at the Vienna General Hospital. His contract was not renewed. He was expelled from the very place where he had made his pivotal discovery, where he had saved hundreds of women, and where his method had proven its undeniable effectiveness. Yet, Semmelweis did have supporters. Several influential physicians with their own authority and foresight, such as Joseph Skoda and Ferdinand von Hebra, recognized the undeniable results of his work. They understood that statistical data did not lie. These individuals, rare voices of reason in a chorus of denial, attempted to defend him, writing articles and speaking in his favor at scientific gatherings. Skoda, a renowned diagnostician, publicly declared Semmelweis's correctness. Hebra, a distinguished dermatologist, even published a detailed article about his discovery in a respected medical journal, aiming to convey his ideas to the general public and the medical community across Europe. They understood that what was at stake was not merely the lives of women, but the future of medicine itself, its transition from dogma to scientific method. However, their efforts proved insufficient. The wave of resistance rooted in pride, fear, and ignorance was too powerful, too pervasive for a few voices to halt. Expelled from Vienna, Semmelweis did not break. He returned to his homeland, Pest. Soon, in 1855, he was appointed professor of obstetrics at the University of Pest. This was more than just an appointment, it was his new battleground. Here, within the walls of the university clinic, he once again implemented his method. He didn't just recommend handwashing, he demanded it. His rules were strict, tolerating no deviations, and once again the miracle recurred. Mortality from childbed fever in his clinic plummeted. From 13%, it fell to less than 1%. This was his personal triumph. In Pest, he was respected, and his clinic became a model. He proved his correctness not with words, but with saved lives. He continued to write, publishing his magnum opus, The Etiology, Concept, and Prophylaxis of Childbed Fever, attempting to convey his truth to colleagues across Europe. He believed that facts spoke for themselves. He was certain his evidence was irrefutable, but the world beyond Pest remained deaf. The medical establishment refused to listen. Semmelweis's ideas were buried with him when, broken and rejected, he ended his days in a mental asylum in 1865. Only decades later, long after his death, was his genius finally recognized. In the 1860s, Louis Pasteur presented his germ theory, the concept of tiny, invisible organisms causing diseases. This provided scientific confirmation for what Semmelweis had intuitively understood. Then, in the 1870s, British surgeon Joseph Lister, building on Pasteur's work, developed the principles of antisepsis in surgery. He began using carbolic acid to disinfect wounds, instruments, and hands. The results were astounding. Post-operative mortality rates sharply declined. Medical schools worldwide began revising their curricula. Hand-washing, once considered humiliating, became a mandatory ritual. Surgical instruments began to be sterilized. Hospitals, once breeding grounds for infection, transformed into places of healing. The protocols implemented by Semmelweis formed the foundation of modern asepsis and antisepsis. They saved millions of lives. They changed the very essence of medicine, transforming it from a guessing game into a precise, evidence-based science. Mortality from postpartum infections, once as high as 25%, dropped to fractions of a percent. The discoveries of Semmelweis, Pasteur, and Lister heralded the dawn of a new era, an era where invisible killers were finally named and conquered. Today, Ignaz Semmelweis's name shines brightly in the annals of medical history. His methods save millions of lives every year. Yet he, the savior of mothers, died in madness, broken by ignorance and pride. The paradox of his legacy is staggering. Humanity embraced his truth, but only after it had destroyed its prophet. His story is not merely a monument to a single genius. It is a harsh chronicle of the birth of true progress, through rejection, through suffering, through the struggle of one person against a world unwilling to see the obvious. It is an eternal echo. The greatest breakthroughs often begin not with applause, but with a solitary voice, rejected by the majority, yet carrying light into the deepest darkness.